Hello and welcome to week 5. This is our only lecture of week 5 because we have the midterm later this week, so it'll just be this one. And today we're going to look at the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. And the Julio-Claudians are the successors of Augustus, who in turn was the successor of Julius Caesar, right? So this is really a family affair, and this is a great place to stop before the midterm too, because once we end with our last emperor, we kind of get into a new age. So this will really conclude our time of looking at the Augustan age, the Julio-Claudian family in Rome. We're also getting back to a little bit of more political history today, a bit more about the ruling class. We looked at Pompeii and how the people lived last week, and so we're kind of back to the royals in a way, you know, the imperial family here. So I want to start by showing you the family tree that we have. So at the top we have Augustus, right? He ruled from 27 BC to 14 CE. And he did have biological children, but none of them lived long enough to adulthood. So his stepson, who was, his wife's son, ends up being his successor. His name is Tiberius, and he rules from 14 to 37. And so already that's sort of a shaky connection, right? Is that it wasn't his biological son, it was his stepson and adopted son. And then once we get to Tiberius, so we'll look at the art of Tiberius today. And then after that, we go to Caligula. So Caligula is Tiberius's great nephew. So again, didn't work out with Tiberius having a son who could take over. So we have to go to Tiberius's great nephew, who is Caligula, the son of Germanicus. So again, another shaky connection. And then from Caligula, who only rules from 37 to 41, so not a long reign, we go back up a generation to Claudius, who is the nephew of Tiberius. So we go back a generation, right? And then after that, we go from Claudius, again, not to a biological son, but to a stepson and adopted son, Nero. So it's a complicated family tree here, and there's not a lot of very direct biological ties, and that will really manifest in the artwork, because what we'll see is that these emperors, due to these shaky connections, need to create legitimacy, and they need to find a way to tie themselves to, whether it be their father, their uncle, whatever, the emperor who came before them. And as I said, that's really going to manifest in the artwork, because we're going to see a lot of propaganda like we did under Augustus. We're going to see these very pointed imperial messages of these rulers telling you what to think about them, about their rule, about their family connections, perhaps their divine connections. So that's really what we're going to be looking at, is the way that these emperors needed to legitimize their rules due to this complicated family tree and the complicated lines of succession that happened. So again, we're going to start with Tiberius, who is Augustus's stepson and the son of Augustus's wife, right? And also his adopted son. And Tiberius was raised in the imperial family. He was raised similar to Augustus on the battlefield. He entered the military from a fairly young age, as a teen, and gained a lot of experience in battle and with diplomacy. So he was a qualified leader, even if he was not the first choice. Unfortunately, to become the emperor and to legitimize that connection between him and Augustus, he is coerced in a way into marrying the daughter of Augustus, Julia. And there is a little bit of maybe resentment there on the side of Tiberius, that he was not the first choice, that he actually had to divorce his wife to marry Julia so that this connection would seem more legitimate. So he's a bit resentful his whole rule, but overall he's a fine ruler. Things are fairly stable over him. He kind of continues that Augustan peace that his stepfather created. So we're going to look at his portraiture and some of his works as well. So in his portrait right away, we see that it is individualized. We can see that it is also quite idealized. It's quite a handsome portrait. He looks very youthful. This is actually pretty early, so this might have depicted him at his actual age. He has that similar haircut to Augustus, so a lot of people connected to Augustus have this short bowl cut that ends really high up on their forehead, so he doesn't really have long bangs. It kind of stops short, and it's a bit of a bowl cut in a way, kind of too, where it's just straight across. But we see him actually looking kind of like Augustus in some of his facial features too. So he kind of has these ears that point out a little bit, which is kind of funny because he wasn't biologically related to Augustus. But we see some similarities. He has a strong brow. And overall, in this portrait, at least, he looks quite calm, quite diplomatic, you could say, and like a strong leader. So we see again this connection to Augustus in the fact that he is purposefully trying to mimic himself after Augustus with the haircut and then even some facial features, which he wouldn't maybe have had if he wasn't actually related to him. So you can tell that it's not Augustus, but it's in sort of the same style. We also see the rise of imperial private art. So we've looked at a lot of public art, right? And big monuments that Augustus made, like the Areopagus or something. But we also see the imperial class commissioning works for private use. And so this, you can see by the size, this is a gem, a cameo gem, and it's only 7.5 by 9 inches. So it's quite small, but very intricate and definitely represents a high level of artistry, that there was probably a very experienced, talented artist who made this, someone that the imperial family would have had the resources to employ. So that's what we see here. This is the Gemma Augustea from 15 CE, so right after Augustus's death. And we see a lot of imagery on it connected to the imperial family. So it's got 2 registers. So and these represent the terrestrial and the celestial realms. So terrestrial and celestial realms, essentially heaven and earth, right? And we see a lot of figures on this. So on the terrestrial register, which is that bottom one, right? Because the heavens are above. So the bottom one is the is Earth. We see barbarians seated and tied up. So you can see that here. And again, we can identify them as barbarians because they have that long, crazy hair. They have beards, right? Looks like they probably have pants on, maybe, because you can see the outline of his legs here. So he might be a barbarian for that reason too. And we see these Romans, who you can tell by their armor. They kind of have these skirts almost, right? These kind of like pleated skirts in a way that they wear in the Roman military. And they are erecting a trophy. So this is clearly a scene of triumph. The trophy is made up of a suit of armor on a large pole. So they've kind of like mounted armor on this pole, and then they're erecting it. It's almost like the Iwo Jima, the flag at Iwo Jima, right? So they're erecting this trophy, and so it's definitely as I said, triumphal, victorious scene. The Romans have just beaten some foreign enemy in battle. And then what we see at the top is the celestial realm. So we see a hierarchy of scale here. So there's not if you remember the Areopagus, where there were all of those figures that were the exact same height, right? All of their heads were like boop, boop, boop in a row. That's a very classical trope. And here what we see is more of a hierarchy of scale where the most important figures are the largest and then the less important figures are smaller. So they're not all equal in that row, but they're differing heights and differing sizes. So we have Augustus is in this scene. So he is in the center. He's going to be this figure here, the shirtless male figure there, and he is being crowned by a laurel crown, right? So it's sort of a sign of his reign and his rule, but also the fact that he's in the celestial realm means that he's been deified. So Augustus, like Julius Caesar, who came before him, is also deified after death, becomes the divine Augustus, right? So we see him kind of chilling up in heaven with all the gods now. And as I said, yes, he matches the portraiture that we see in his lifetime. He's also very idealized, right? So looks more like he's maybe in his 30s than how old he was when he died, in his 70s. We see that really sheer drapery, right? With those deep folds as well. We also see the personification of Rome. So Roma is going to be the woman sitting next to him right here. And again, I think we've talked about this personifications, right? So taking a concept and turning it into a person in artwork as a personification. And that's what we see with the city of Rome, that Rome, or even the Roman Empire, but it started out in the city, was personified by this woman. And she would often look kind of like a military goddess in a way. So that's what we see next to Augustus, and the way they are looking at each other kind of makes that link between Augustus and Rome, or Roma. We also see Jupiter here. So Jupiter is in the back, I believe, looking on at this scene. We have other personified figures of kind of heroic concepts. We have also, and then yes, this is the important part though, is that we have Tiberius pictured here. So the successor of Augustus is pictured stepping out of this chariot. So that's Tiberius. And you can see his foot down there. He's getting off of this chariot, which is interesting because he's in the celestial realm too, even though he's still alive at this point. But it's perhaps that, you know, maybe there is some kind of scene that are connecting the two where there was this victory on earth, and now we see Tiberius kind of communicating with the heavens, going to tell Augustus, his stepfather, about this victory that happened, right? He's going to report back. So we're creating a couple of links here. We're creating a link between Augustus and the divine, and therefore this family and the divine. We're creating a link between Tiberius and Augustus, right? And therefore, because of that, we are also creating a link between Tiberius and the heavenly divine world. So as we talked a lot about with Augustus, he wouldn't actually say he was a god while he was alive, but he might hint at it. So we're seeing the same thing with Tiberius, where he's not saying that he's necessarily a god. He's not part of this pantheon that we see in the upper scene, but he is getting out of a chariot, like he just came from Earth, to come report. So he's clearly closely connected. He's having conversations with people who are divine. So again, making that link that maybe he too is at least divinely inspired, you know, to rule, and perhaps will become a god after his death. Next up, we have the Bosco Reale cups. So Bosco Reale, we talked about last time, just very briefly, right? Because we saw some paintings from there. So here are cups that were found. They're made of silver, and they are today in the Louvre. You can go see them. Very famous cups too. Kind of a common sign of Rome, or famous in the art world, maybe. And again, we see imperial family imagery on these cups. So again, we see Augustus enthroned. So that's what you see in that upper image, right? Augustus enthroned, and we also see, again, military captives or barbarian captives. We see Mars, the god of war, right? We see him leading captives. And then next to Augustus here, right, that is a depiction of Venus. And we see Venus, you know, who is a relative of Augustus through Julius Caesar, right? We see her handing a sort of a statuette of victory to Augustus, a winged Nike, and Nike is the personification, the goddess of victory. So Venus is handing this personified victory to Augustus, who is crowned. And we know that it is Venus because we also see a winged Cupid at her feet. So here's Augustus also. So that's Augustus, and there's Augustus, and then there's Venus, and we see just behind her this Cupid figure who has wings. So if we go to the next slide, we see a few more scenes. We see also, again, Tiberius in a chariot. So this, I guess, is common imagery, right? We see it on the gem, and now we see it here. And Tiberius on his chariot is also being crowned. So the way that we had the already crowned Augustus sitting on his throne, we now see Tiberius being crowned on his chariot. So perhaps this is, you know, we see it around 10 CE. So this is maybe still under the reign of Augustus. But what we're seeing is that Tiberius has clearly been chosen to succeed Augustus, right? And they're making that point through these images here. We see a couple other of themes from Roman art that you'll see again. One of them is a sacrifice of a bull. So that's what we see in this lower left image. We see sort of a temple in the background, right? And then we see in the foreground, it's much larger also. So we have sort of some depth perspective here, that things in the background are going to be smaller and the things in the foreground are bigger. But we see a bull sacrifice, so that's part of this religious ritual likely. Could have been in relation to maybe a triumph or another sort of ritual of the imperial family, perhaps, because we see those two images closely connected. So we see a lot of kind of traditional imperial imagery here, scenes of triumph, scenes of divinity being very closely connected with emperors. This is another sort of public work. So those were some more private works that maybe would have been in the possession of the imperial family, and maybe only seen by them or seen by close colleagues, you know, people working with the imperial family, right? And it's important to note that also sometimes those are the people you have to convince the most, because the people probably aren't going to try to take power for themselves. What you have to worry about are the senators, the other politicians, you know, minor politicians, especially military generals. So sometimes it is almost more important to put imagery like that and propagandic imageries, you know, on a bowl that you might have when you are having dinner with a close military general, right? Because those are the people that you need to convince, maybe more than some merchant or something who doesn't have a lot of political stake or political power. So those are private works. We're going to go to a public work now, which is the city gate at Sapinum in Italy. As you can see on the map, Sapinum is, oh gosh, it's so small. It's right there though. It's kind of not quite in southern Italy, but it's south of Rome, also in central Italy. And pretty well preserved city if you go there today. But we see a gate here, so a gate leading into the city, right? We see it made of ashlar masonry on the bottom, so those cut stones that have been put together, right? And then at the top, we see a more decorative arch. And we see a couple things here. So we see an inscription, right, at the top. And then we see bound prisoners on either side, and we see a head in the middle. So let's talk about what all of these things are. So the bound prisoners are likely a reminder of military victories, right? We've seen this before. They're a reminder of Rome's might and also a threat to whoever sees them. Don't cross us because this could be you. You know, it's similar to, I don't know, I think of that scene in like Pirates of the Caribbean where there's the skeletons like hanging outside, you know? So it's kind of a threat, a warning, right? Remember how powerful we are, that, you know, if you cross us, you know, you too will become a captive or worse. And then we also see that inscription, and the inscription talks about Tiberius and Germanicus, who is Tiberius's adopted son. So Tiberius and Germanicus paid for this gate, and then they also paid for other kind of public works in the city to represent them doing their duty as members of the imperial family. And this, again, is trying to win the favor of the public, right? That we're going to give you public works, similar to Augustus building his forum, Julius Caesar building his forum, that kind of thing. Here we see them shoring up the city's infrastructure. They're giving them a gate, right? And they are putting a big inscription on the gate so that everyone knows who built it, right? This was donated by Tiberius and Germanicus. So that is who you can thank for it. We also see interesting masonry. So as I said, the ashlar stone on the bottom, right? And then this kind of looks like opus incertum, right? But it's not. So this is a different style of facing, of stone facing. So you can see on the left, opus incertum, to remind you, kind of all those stones, you take, it's concrete, and then you face it with these little stones, and you kind of just put them together as however you can. It's kind of like a puzzle. You say this one fits here, and I don't know, I guess that one fits there, and you just kind of make it work. And you'll notice that that's 120 BC, so that's a little bit earlier. So where we are here in, what was it, 10, 15 CE, is a different style called opus reticulatum, opus reticulatum. And this is categorized by these diamond-shaped stones. So we see every single one almost the same, right? They're all this diamond shape, and they're placed very purposefully and intentionally. It's not like we're just trying to make it fit wherever we can. They're making a design out of it, and what they're doing is making all of these parallel lines, right, that create kind of other diamond patterns in a way. So, you know, you can start at one of these lines and kind of follow it, and it goes all the way straight, right? You have all these different lines. So a bit more organized in a way, but just another style of facing concrete, right? So opus reticulatum, those diamond stones placed in parallel lines. And we also have in the middle of the arch, so we have the opus reticulatum, we have these voussoirs blocks, which are kind of the way that the blocks are put in the arch, right? very traditional arch here, where we have a keystone and then built down from that. And the center, you can see a head, right? A human head. And this is what is called a protome. So a protome is essentially that. It is a form of art that has a frontal view of an animal head or a human bust. And it's often placed into buildings or placed into arches like you see here. So it's sort of, in a way, relief, but kind of attached there. It is an apotropaic symbol. I knew I was going to mess that up. Apotropaic symbol, which literally means to kind of turn away. It comes from a Greek verb, actually, that means to turn away from. But here it's used as an adjective, apotropaic, and it means something that wards off evil. So if you have a symbol like this, it's going to be kind of a good luck symbol, or it's going to more accurately ward off bad luck, evil influences. And so again, perhaps a good thing to put on the gate of a city, right? That if you're walking into this city, you want to defend it in a way, right? This is sort of, it's attached to the wall of the city, so it's in a defensive feature. And so it all kind of works together here, that we have an apotropaic head that is warding off evil. We have these two bound prisoners who are warning you not to try anything, right? Because otherwise you'll end up like them. And then we have this inscription also that talks about the power that the city is under, right? That it's almost kind of saying this city is under the protection of Tiberius because he paid for a bunch of things to be set up here. So all of this is working together as a way to ward off any potential enemies who might want to attack the city. Similar, right, to our arch in Glanum. So we see a bit of a different style here, right? So we see the opus reticulatum on the left, and we see just ashlar stone on the right. But we have a similar idea here of bound prisoners being on monumental architecture, right? The one at Glanum has a bit more decorative elements, right? It has that kind of vine frieze going around it, has coffers in the middle, these columns on the outside, as opposed to the city gate at Supinum, but it was made about the same time, right? And so we start seeing more infrastructure in cities being shorn up with defensive measures, and also a lot more imagery of bound prisoners, bound captives. So we're going to move now to away from public architecture, and once again to private. So we're just kind of flip-flopping back and forth. So we're going to the Via Sperlonga, which is also in Italy on the coast, and we see that Tiberius put up public architecture, public gifts almost, right? He gifted that arch to the city, but we also see that he built things for himself, and this is something we're really going to see going forward. We're going to look at a lot of these for the rest of the class, pretty much, at these villas, the imperial villas that each emperor would build for himself, similar to how they started all building their own forums, right? We also see them building their own vacation homes, basically, right? Mansions. It kind of makes sense. This is their Mar-a-Lago, right? That they're going to go escape from all of these stresses of the political world too. And they a lot of times are very large, very lavish, just total party palaces. So this is one that we see at the Villa Sperlonga, which is associated with Tiberius, right? So this was his kind of getaway, when it just gets too much. Built in 25 CE, you can see a plan of it here that really shows the size. It was a very large structure. We have a reconstruction of it there. And as I said, it was on the water. So it's actually had a grotto that was sort of incorporated into it. So this is the grotto. It actually would have been a dining room. And so you can see from that it would have, there's kind of these pools of water, and then the pools actually go into the grotto as well. And that is where people would dine, and it would be kind of an interesting experience, definitely a experiential architecture, right? That you're in this cave, in this grotto. What we see also is a bunch of sculptures. You can kind of see in the reconstruction that, they have placed the sculptures there. And these were massive, massive sculptures, huge works of art, really detailed as well. And clearly, again, something that probably only the imperial family could commission. And what we see here are scenes from myth. So with the Aeneid, which was written in the reign of Augustus, and that's the story of how Aeneas travels from the Trojan War to Rome and essentially sets up the precursor that would later become Rome, that Romulus and Remus, his descendants, would then go on to found. And so we see this kind of renewed interest in epic myth, in heroic myth. And that goes back to Greece, right, with Homer. So we see the Odyssey, the Iliad, and the Aeneid is very closely connected to those because it's almost like a sequel, right? It's that after the Trojan War, this is what Aeneas did, and then the Odyssey is also after the Trojan War, this is what Odysseus did. So we see a renewed interest in those stories, and they play out in the sculpture, in the imperial sculpture that we have here. So this would have been, as I said, in the dining room at that grotto. And what we see is Polyphemus, who is from the Odyssey, and that is the Cyclops that Odysseus, one of the many monsters that Odysseus meets on his way back from Troy to his homeland. If you don't know the story, he sets off with his crew of men, and it takes him 10 years to get home because he just keeps running into all these different monsters. So this is one of the monsters that he runs into, the Cyclops, and it's a great story, that he traps them in his cave, planning to eat them, right? And then while he is sleeping, Odysseus pokes out his eye, right? And so we now have a blind Cyclops, and the men are able to escape. Kind of an iconic scene from the Odyssey. So what we see here is we have our Cyclops, right? So with the giant, as you can see, he has only the one eye, and he's kind of sprawled out, and he's likely asleep because the men snuck up on him while he was sleeping. So what you see is a very a narrative moment, right? That it's this moment right before the action. We can pinpoint it. And we have Odysseus about to poke out his eye. They're about to just give the final jab. It's this moment of anticipation. So it's a pretty cool scene also for a cave, right? Because this was in a grotto, and the scene from the Odyssey takes place in a cave, that they're all trapped in Polyphemus's cave. So we see a connection here between the scene that's being played out and the actual lived space that they are in. So there's this connection between the scene and the setting. Odysseus is likely the figure at the very top. It's not in perfect condition anymore. But we see here, this is likely this is likely Odysseus with that cap, and maybe kind of wearing a cloak. And we see a lot of similarities here to Hellenistic styles of sculpture. The Hellenistic Baroque, we call it. And the Hellenistic Baroque, I think I've mentioned before, is really categorized by high drama, very intense emotional expression. It's often also does depict a scene from a certain moment, right? That we are trapped in this moment in time, that you've come into a certain scene at a certain moment. So it's not like the classical where we just have, our Dory Forest, our spear bearer, just kind of standing there, like he's just kind of hanging out. We see a scene from a specific story. So I wanted to do this comparison between the head of Laocoon, who you may have heard of, may have not, this very famous sculpture. So we see that one here, and just the intense, insane drama, right? And this is actually a Roman copy of a Hellenistic original. So again, we see this Roman renewed interest in the Hellenistic style, but super high drama. Just so much action happening, and wild body movement. Limbs are flailing, and in this case we have a serpent who's attacking the central figure, and then the two smaller figures. So we see hierarchy of scale here too, and especially these anguished emotional expressions on their faces, right? That you can't just like feel how they're feeling. You almost feel like you're experiencing it, because it's so over the top. It's so intensely done. This is not, again, the calm, just facade of the classical. This is very over-the-top, dramatic, expressive. And that's what we're seeing here, right? So in the face of Odysseus, we also see a similarity in the styling, right? That Odysseus doesn't look like a Roman man. He looks like a Hellenistic man. That long hair, the Greek beard, he looks much more Greek. But also, yeah, that pain in his eyes, his mouth is open a little bit, like maybe he's about to say something to his men who are about to attack. His brow is kind of furrowed, and his head is also out a little bit, as if he's like looking at something. So we see a lot of drama, a lot of similarities here, and these anguished facial expressions from the Hellenistic world. Here's another one, the sculpture group of Scylla. So Scylla was another monster that Odysseus encounters on his way back. And we see that again here. We actually see kind of a boat scene. Scylla was a part woman, part dog, part sea monster, essentially. You can see these dogs attacking the men. It's very expressive, right? Again, high drama. We're seeing a moment in time from this story. So we're seeing the moment that they are being attacked. And these, again, just wild body positions, these limbs that are flailing. Similar to the Laocoon, we see like overlapping figures. We see dogs, you know, attacking the men, and then the men kind of overlapping with one another. So high drama again, and something that we see as the Romans start to look back at the Hellenistic world and also have this renewed interest in myth. So that's going to do it for Tiberius, and we're going to move now to his successor Caligula. And Caligula can be translated as Little Boots, which I just love. So Caligula, Little Boots, he got that nickname because he joined his father Germanicus on the battlefield from a young age, and so kind of was raised in military camps and on the battlefield, and so his fellow soldiers, I guess, gave him this nickname, and it stuck. So Caligula, he took power in 37 after the death of Tiberius and was the appointed heir, but we don't see many portraits of him, and you will notice that his reign was only 4 years, right? And this is because Caligula was just the worst. He was absolutely hated by everyone, by the public, by the Senate, his fellow politicians. He was depicted in biographies of him from the time as selfish and arrogant. One historian goes as far as to call him a monster. So definitely not someone you want in power, and that is why his reign was so short, because he was assassinated in 41 CE. But let's look at the portrait that we do have, you know, one of the few. Another reason that we don't have very many portraits, first of all, because he didn't reign for a very long time, but also because people hated him. And so once he was out of power, a lot of his artwork was destroyed. You know, people didn't want to see him anymore. They did not want to have a statue of him up in their town anymore because the public opinion of him was really just so low. But so this is a rare intact portrait that we have of Caligula. It's from Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. And we see him looking very Julio-Claudian, very in the Augustan style. So we see that really short, cropped kind of bowl cut, right, where you have these little bangs, but they're all the same length, and they kind of just go across the very top of your forehead. He's got the ears that stick out a little bit, right, which whether or not, you know, he really had those is considering the blood ties here, or lack thereof. And we see him again looking a little bit classical. So we don't see that expression of the Hellenistic, right? We see him looking a more classical, demure, calm face, which probably does not line up with the portrait that we have of him from our biographies, which depict him as, you know, a terrible person. So anyway, he is assassinated in 41 because of that low public opinion, and he is replaced by Claudius. And so if we go back and we think about that family tree for a second, you'll remember that I mentioned that we go down from Tiberius to Caligula, and then we go back up a generation. So from Tiberius, Caligula was Tiberius's grandnephew, and what happens is that we go back up a generation because we're like, he was so bad, he was the worst. He was also fairly young when he took power because they were thinking, oh, we'll have stability, we'll have a long reign, we'll give it to someone young, right? Didn't work out. So we go to Claudius. So Claudius is actually older, he's the generation above, and he's going to rule from 41 to 54. And overall, Claudius is not bad. He's not the most exciting ruler because he is older. He didn't expect to be in power, right? He didn't think he would ever be emperor because Caligula was kind of the chosen heir. We also see him not being as maybe charismatic, and he was not particularly liked, but he wasn't very disliked. He likely had some kind of perhaps disability, like he walked with a limp, so he had something maybe wrong with his leg. He had maybe a lame foot, something like that. And he also maybe stuttered. We have evidence, you know, people saying that he stuttered. So he wasn't as you know, and nowadays, right, those are over, you can overcome those, right? But in the Romans were a bit more harsh on people who were like that. So they saw that as signs of weakness, essentially. And so he was seen not to be as strong of a leader. But nonetheless, he ruled for a fair amount of time. And he was essentially even more not legitimate than anyone else, which we already see a lot of shaky ties here, right? That there are not necessarily blood ties, that there's sort of these fabricated links between rulers here. And we really see that with Claudius, because not only is he Tiberius's nephew, and I guess the uncle of Caligula, he was also not supposed to be in power. He was never in the line of succession. And essentially when Caligula was assassinated and there was this power vacuum, he was put into power by the Praetorian Guard, who are kind of like the secret service of the emperor. They're kind of his military force that is directly his. So this isn't really the official way to do it. There wasn't some kind of vote. There wasn't a decision made. It was kind of a military decision in a way. So he has even more reason to really promote a legitimacy of his reign, and really he needs to convince people that he should be in power, that just because he might have a limp, he might stutter, he might have been put into power in this weird way, he might have a weird family connection to the rest of the Julio-Claudians, he's still the ruler, and that there still needs to be stability in the empire. He doesn't want to be overthrown, right? He wants to still be recognized as the ruler. And overall, he does end up being a pretty good leader. Nothing too crazy happens under him. And we see that he actually does build a lot. So if you go back to the Pompeii lecture, we talked about those apartment buildings at Ostia, right? Ostia, the port city of Rome, kind of that it's in between the ocean and Rome. He really builds all that. So Ostia is totally built up under him. And it's a great harbor, so that is very influential for the city. He also, England is conquered under his rule, so that the island of Britain, right, is conquered under his rule and becomes a province. So we see him getting things done. He expands the empire, he builds up the empire in terms of architecture. So not a bad ruler, but also not very well liked, especially by the Senate, by fellow politicians who didn't have a say in his ascension to the throne. So how does he create legitimacy? Well, we see here this portrait of him with attributes of Jupiter. So we see him trying to create a divine link in a way. And this is something that we'll see going forward, where you kind of dress up as a god, right? So the eagle is a huge symbol of Jupiter, of the god Jupiter. That's his symbol. So if you ever see the eagle, that's it's a sign of Rome, but it's also a sign of Jupiter. And we see him with the laurels, right? And if you'll remember, that was what was being placed on Augustus's head in heaven, right? He had the laurels being crowned on him. And then he's in a very confident stance. His body is very idealized, but his face is not. So this is really important, because Augustus, even though he was in his 70s, he had the idealized body and he had the face of a 35-year-old or 30-year-old, maybe even younger. What we see here is a very idealized body type that looks like it could be the body of a 30-year-old, but the face is not idealized. So the face is very realistic. We see evidence of age. So we see these lines under his eyes, like bags under his eyes that, older men might get. We see these really deep, what are they called? Nasolabial lines, which are the ones right here that kind of go from your nose to your mouth. Nasolabial lines, and they're very deep. And that's, as people age, they get deeper and deeper, you get more wrinkles. And so that's what we're seeing here on his face, these deep lines, these bags under his eyes. We see some lines in his forehead as well. What else? There's he has kind of loose skin underneath his neck, right? Kind of like maybe a little bit like a turkey neck, like older people might get as well. So overall, he's not trying to look idealized in his face. That is a much more realistic trait, although his body is idealized. And he also does still look very Julio-Claudian in terms of the haircut, right? He's got that bowl cut, and then also he kind of has those ears that stick out a little bit. So he's connecting himself to the family for sure, but he's doing a little bit of a departure from the stylistic norms of the Julio-Claudians. And this is because he was very interested in the Republic. He was very fascinated by it. He actually wrote a history of the Republic, and that realism is something that I know we didn't really have time to talk about with the Republic, but that was more seen as a Republic trait in some that we have from the Republic, is that it looked a little more realistic, and then Augustus brought it back to the classical. So So we see a mix here, right? That we see him using that Republican style of realism in the face, but we also see Augustus's kind of Julio-Claudian traits and then a very idealized body still. So a mix there. And again, that those attributes of Jupiter, which are kind of trying to connect him to the divine, and again, perhaps prove that his power is legitimate, that he is chosen by the gods to rule, that Jupiter has sanctioned him. Jupiter says, "You're good, bro. Like, you're the one I want to rule." And so kind of creating that link. We see also some female portraiture that does similar things, where they create, they kind of create an image of themselves as a god. So this is Antonia Augusta, who is the mother of Claudius. And we see her in the guise of Venus Genetrix, right? And that is, should ring a bell for you, because that's the temple that Julius Caesar had in his forum, right? The temple to Venus Genetrix. And that is Venus, founder of the family. And so we see that here with Antonia, who is the mother of Claudius, right? So they're both kind of mothers of generations of rulers, that they are the ones to birth important figures and create a dynasty. So we see that mimicking there, that they are both the sort of matriarchal heads of the family. So we see that there with Antonia. And I wanted to mention also, I think I put this on the midterm sheet, but this one's not going to be on the midterm. You don't have to know this one for the midterm. It's more just to compare, right, that we see Claudius, and then we see similar divine attributes being applied to his mother's portraits as well. So again, I want to move to kind of private art, right? Art that would have been for the imperial family or people close to them that they would have seen. So this is the Grand Camée. It's from 50 CE in Paris now today, so you can go see it there. It is made of sardonyx, which is, if you say onyx, it's kind of a type of onyx, of layered onyx. And we see again this cameo relief in a way. So also quite small, 12 inches, only about a foot tall. Let's see, so what do we see on here? Similar to the gem that we saw under Tiberius, we're going to see similar imagery here. So again, we have a register at the bottom, and that is going to have some barbarian captives in it. And then we also have sort of a link here that there's these prisoners here, and then we also have a prisoner who's in this main scene. And then we have a scene in the middle that is kind of a terrestrial scene. So it's on Earth. These are all people who are alive at the moment. And then we have a heavenly scene up here that depicts people who have already ascended to be with the gods, right? So who do we have? A lot of people. So first up, as I said, those barbarian captives when we work from the way up. And then here, this central figure is Claudius, right? So he is sitting enthroned. He has that laurel crown that denotes, royalty, the emperor. He is also right in the middle. So, that's kind of an important place, that he sets himself. He is the center of all of this that's happening around him. Next to him, we see his wife, Agrippina, who is his fourth wife, I believe. And then we see Claudius making direct eye contact with his stepson and adopted son, Nero. So Nero is the son of Agrippina, who Claudius adopts. So this is Nero here, and then this is Nero's wife at the time, Octavia. And we also see more of Claudius's children over here, but those are not the ones who are going to succeed him, right? So Nero is the heir, and so that is why he is making that eye contact with Claudius. He's dressed very militarily. He has like the Roman military outfit on with the kind of skirt and the helmet. And he's looking right at his adopted father, as if they're having a conversation and Claudius is saying like, I choose you, I give the empire to you, right? There's that link. We also see other members, I think, of the family behind them. And then if we move up to the top, we see more members of Claudius's family, but we see the older generation. So we see his parents. We see Drusus here on a Pegasus, kind of ascending into heaven, maybe. And then we see Antonia, who you saw as Venus Genetrix. We see her also kind of being carried to heaven, as well as Claudius's brother Germanicus, who you'll remember is the father of Caligula. It gets very complicated. So we see all of them up in that sphere. They are the forebears of this dynasty, right? They are people who came before in this dynasty, and then below that we have the current dynasty as well as the future, that we have Claudius, who's emperor, and we have Nero, who's going to succeed him. And then we also, just because we can, you know, have a bunch of depictions of barbarian captives, and just to remind you that we're really strong, right? So definitely a sign of the imperial family, a very, you know, family was very important, dynasty, the idea of continuing your line, especially for the royals, right? That they want to show that there is a stable empire, that everything is going to plan, that there is a stable succession of power. And also it's kind of a who's who of the royal family also, right? The fact that they are all here together kind of links them together. We see a similar thing on this Julio-Claudian Dynasty relief from Ravenna. And this again is really even more so intentionally connecting it to the older generations. So what we see here is Augustus, we see Livia, we see Julius Caesar in the center, and then we see the two parents of Claudius, Antonia and Drusus, next to them. So Julius Caesar in the center is kind of the beginning of this dynasty, right? That's where they get their name, the Julio part, Julius Caesar. And then we see Augustus and Livia, who are going to be the next phase, right? The next generation. And they are going to beget people. And then we have Antonio and Drusus, who are the parents of the current emperor, and they are also related to all these Julio-Claudians. So again, we see this multi-generational depiction of this very important family, and I just couldn't help but compare it to things that we see now, right? And that these important, these powerful families, where that is sort of what makes, that's what where their strength comes from, is the fact that you have this family. You know, we see it like even with the Kardashians, and you know, I think every Christmas they do like a portrait, right? And I thought it's just interesting because you see all the different generations represented, right? You see the grandma, and then you see Kris Jenner, right? And then you see the daughters, and then you see the children. So there's almost this idea that like we've come from other generations that were important. We are currently important, and guess what? Like our children are going to be as well. Our children are also going to be powerful. It's this family, a powerful family, right? So moving on from portraiture for a second, under Claudius, we also see him creating public works like Tiberius, like Augustus, like they all did. This is the Porta Maggiore in Rome, essentially a gate on steroids, a huge gate made out of travertine. It very importantly has rusticated stone. So we see the stone looking very rough and unfinished. We're not trying to make it look perfect. We're actually kind of intentionally showing that it's rough and a bit imperfect. It is doing so because, again, we see an interest from Claudius in looking at the Republic, right? He was a big fan, not necessarily of the political structure of the Republic, but he was kind of interested in that time period. And so perhaps this is kind of vintage. He's kind of trying to like do a little throwback here, make it look old, make it look like something that's been around a while, right? That something has kind of, that's been weathered with this rustication. That's what that does. Something else that we see here is the fact that it is very heavy and solid, right? So this is a stable monument. You're not going to be able to knock it down if you're an invader, right? It feels very strong and stable, and perhaps is a reference to the Republic, first of all, where we start to see, we don't see as slender forms as we'll see later on, but also a reference to the stability of the empire, right? That if we have these heavy materials, we, you know, that are going to stand for a long time, well, it mimics this dynasty, this important dynasty that we have that's also going to stand for a long time. So that was Claudius, right? And as I said, he was a pretty good leader. He got some stuff done, didn't have too many scandals, wasn't particularly liked a ton, but he was fine. But upon his death, his adopted son, Nero, who we saw in that gem, right? Nero takes over. And Nero is the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and that is for a reason. He essentially causes the downfall of the dynasty. And if you thought Caligula was bad, just wait till you hear about Nero. So Nero takes throne at a young age, at age 17, and he rules how the most immature 17-year-old that you've ever met would rule. He was a huge partier. He lived a life of absolute excess. I mean, he was raised as the son of the emperor, so you can imagine that he had a very privileged upbringing, and he just loved to party, absolutely, through massive wild parties and orgies and all kinds of things. He loved the arts and music and theater. He wanted to be a musician, and there's tons of stories about him like basically forcing people to sit and like listen to him play music and then they would like have to clap, right? Yeah, so he basically wanted to be like a rock star and he just wanted to party and play music and just live this life of excess and sin and all these crazy things, right? There's just a lot of really weird stories about like parties that he threw where just weird things would happen. So yeah, some of this possibly could be exaggeration by historians, by his biographers who were writing later, in that they wanted to make him look even worse than he was. Like if he was very unpopular, you know, then they're going to say, oh, well, he, you know, had sex with animals and stuff. Like that would be really bad. Like a bad thing to say about something that you hate, or someone you hate, right? Like that would really defame their name. So we're not sure how much of it is true and how much of it is kind of sensationalized press. But nonetheless, he definitely was a very arrogant, privileged, party-focused emperor. And because of that, he was super unpopular. He also was quite cruel. He essentially murdered everyone he knew, you know, suspecting that they were against him. He was a bit paranoid, murders his family. So Agrippina, who you saw on the gem, also has her murdered. So not a good guy. Nero, the worst. And we'll talk even more about ways that he was the worst. What we see here, though, is in his portrait, we see actually, and perhaps importantly, a removal or a distancing from Julio-Claudian imagery. So we started to see that with Claudius, right? And that he wasn't looking as idealized. And that's maybe, well, we see some of that too here because Nero was a bit bigger, right? And he was a bit overweight. And we definitely don't see him trying to have the six-pack that Augustus did. We see him depicted somewhat realistically there. We also see, though, a difference in his styling. And so we'll see that he doesn't have that short bowl cut that all the others had. It's quite long, with these long, like, comma-like bangs that they're very, like, striated. And they go quite longer on him. It's also longer around the sides, and he has kind of this beard in a way, or sideburns, but later you'll see that it really turns into like a neck beard. That's his thing. He's like Nero the neck beard. So if you see any portraits of someone with a big furry neck beard, that's probably Nero. And so we see a little bit of a departure, and that might be because he was not actually a blood member of the Julio-Claudian family. He was adopted into it, and he came from a somewhat prominent family on the other side. And there's a thought that maybe he wants to connect himself more with his blood family, and he wants to create a new direction for the imperial dynasty here, that he's kind of distancing himself from all the Julio-Claudians and wanting to put his blood family in power now. So we see a bit of a departure. And we also see, when we look at descriptions of how he looked in the historical record and textual sources, we see that matching his actual portraits, that the way that he's described as a person matches what we see with long hair. He's unfortunately also a redhead, which again, just bringing a bad name to us. But yes, this is another portrait that we see of him. Again, you can see that neck beard, right? Just given a bad name to redheads, but we'll get past it. And he just, especially, I love this reconstruction, because like, does he not just look like punchable in that picture? Like, he has the most punchable face there. He just looks so smug and like arrogant and just like staring at you. So whoever in modern times made this portrait shares our all opinions about Nero. But yeah, just to show you again, the kind of difference between him and his adopted father, right? First of all, he is much younger than Claudius was when he took the throne, but we definitely see a departure. He has much longer hair. He's starting to have the beard. It's longer. His hair is longer in the back as well. And we don't really see those sticking out ears anymore, right? His ears are quite smaller. They're a lot smaller than Claudius's. So he's not trying to connect himself in the way that if we go back to Augustus, tried to make himself look kind of like Julius Caesar, even though there was no blood link. There's no blood link here either, but Nero says that's fine. I'm going to rule anyway. We also see this on his coins, and we see depictions of his life of excess on these coins. So he looks similar, right? He's a bit overweight. He has that long hair, especially in the front and in the back. And he looks very similar in his portraits. And then on the back of these coins, we see depictions of him just living it up. So the top one, we see him in the guise of Apollo. And so he's making himself look like a god, which as we've seen precedent for that. But it's Apollo, who's the god of music. And we see Nero dressed up as Apollo with his robe. And then also he's holding a lyre, and he's playing this lyre because, he was such a good musician that, he had to force people to clap for him. And then we also see at the bottom, he was also very athletic. He was really obsessed with the Olympics, the Olympic Games in Greece, and actually went to the Olympic Games and competed himself. So the emperor was competing in the Olympics just because he wanted to. And so we see him here on horseback holding a spear, looking a bit athletic and a bit militaristic as well here. And he, like Tiberius, we looked at one of Tiberius's villas, and they also had residences in Rome, more imperial residences where they would live when they were ruling. And so we see them building those here. Augustus famously built a big one on the Palatine Hill, which we just didn't have time to talk about, but he built a big palace on the Palatine Hill. It's actually where we get the term palatial. It's from Palatine. And Nero builds one nearby. So he's going to build his house in Rome, sort of in between the Palatine and Esquiline hills. And it's sort of a way to link them. So we call it the Domus Transitoria because the idea of it's a transitory, it goes in between two hills here. This was his first house, so built around 56, and it was a lavish house. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't. You'll see what we get to next, but this was a lavish house. So it's quite lavish. We don't actually have a lot left of it, so we don't know exactly how lavish it would have looked, but we see these frescoes, right? Very intricate, lavish frescoes. We also see the use of concrete, and so that's going to really expand under Nero, this use of concrete to build barrel vaulted rooms so that you don't have to have just like straight roofs, right, where there's like post and lintel construction, but you're going to be able to kind of knock out the ceiling into an arch, into a barrel vault. So it's going to also allow taller ceilings, which means bigger windows, more windows, and you're going to be able to let more light in. So we start to see that here at the Domus Transitoria. We also see like a little fountain pool in the front, right, and these decorated rooms. So overall, a nice house, lavish house for the emperor. Well, what we are going to see a few years later is the breakout in 64 AD in Rome, a great fire, a huge fire, a massive disaster for the city. It rages for 5 days, destroys a huge part of the city, much of which is the homes of average people. So many people lose their homes. And this is another nail in the coffin for Nero because people say that he didn't do anything to contain it. He didn't really care. That's where you hear that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, right? And that actually, he did like music. So he's playing his violin while Rome is burning down behind him. There are differing reports about where Nero was during this fire. That is what one historian says. Another historian says that he was actually out of the city, which actually might be worse because it implies that he maybe knew what was going to happen and got out. There is definitely speculation, and there was speculation even at the time, that he himself planned the fire, that he planned for it to be set, and that he planned for it to burn down a lot of the city so that he could then claim it for himself. So like I said, another nail in the coffin of Nero, another reason for the people to hate him. And as we see, one of his historians saying, Nero, all the same, made use of the ruin of his country and built a palace. So he had the Domus Transitoria. After the Great Fire in 64, he constructs the Domus Aurea, which is the Golden House. And this is a massive estate. He builds it on the land that was burned. So he takes the land that average people used to be living on, their homes burned down, and he takes it for himself to build a massive palace, something that does not go over well with the population of Rome, as you can imagine. But we're going to look at the Domus Aurea. It was not only a house, as I said, it was an estate. There was massive kind of natural land. So there were artificial lakes and woods and gardens. You can see here is very well landscaped. It was also well decorated. So we see this massive portrait, a massive statue. It was called a colossus. It was the Colossus of Nero. And it was basically this massive statue, 100 feet tall, of Nero in the guise of Sol, who is the sun god. And so he depicts himself as the sun god, and he builds this massive statue of himself, which sits in this kind of colonnaded area. And I want to take the time to actually read the description of the Domus Aurea. So the entrance hall was large enough to contain a huge statue of Nero in the guise of Sol, the sun god, 120 feet tall, and the pillared arcade ran for a whole mile. An enormous pool, like a sea, was surrounded by buildings made to resemble cities, and by a landscape garden consisting of plowed fields, vineyards, pastures, and woodlands, where every variety of domestic and wild animal roamed about. Parts of the house were overlaid with gold and studded with precious stones and mother of pearl. All the dining rooms had ceilings of fretted ivory, the panels of which could slide back and let a rain of flowers or of perfume from a hidden sprinkler shower upon Nero's guests. The main dining room was circular, and its roof revolved day and night in time with the sky. Seawater, or sulfur water, was always on tap in the baths. When the palace had been decorated throughout in this lavish style, Nero dedicated it and condescended to remark, "Good, now I can at last begin to live like a human being." So an incredibly lavish palace and an incredibly bold attitude to go with it. You also see a depiction here on this coin of the Colossus of Nero. So here is that artificial lake that was mentioned, right? Surrounded by this kind of colonnade. And then we also here mention, here's a big plan of it. So you can see this was the Domus Transitoria, and this is now the whole Domus Aurea. So it's, gosh, I don't even know, like grew in size by like 6 times or something. And we also see an even greater use of concrete, and even more expanded use of concrete in the Domus Aurea. So we see even, these giant barrel vaulted hallways and rooms with a lot of light let in. Something else that depiction mentioned is the dining room. And the dining room is a very important room for our study because it was a massive octagonal domed room. It had this oculus in the ceiling that you see to let light in, as well as other windows. There was a big emphasis on light. And we also see that we heard that the ceiling like rotated, so that if at nighttime it would look like night, and daytime there would be like different constellations and things. It also had an opening that would allow like perfume to be, sprayed on the guests, or flowers, very lavish. We also see, a really big use of concrete here. It's such a large space. So they're really experimenting with concrete. We're going to see this even, we saw this before. It's a common thing in Roman architecture. We also see a departure from square spaces to round spaces, this emphasis on making it round. A very dramatic room. Here we also see how you can see how the light would get in, right? The plan of that dining room, very, very lavish, and definitely showing a strong use of concrete and the possibilities of concrete, what we can do with it, what we can do with the interplay of these round spaces and light being let in, to fill this octagonal space. Again, this is a case of experiential architecture, that you're experiencing this space in a very specific way, an intentional way, but yes, very lavish. Unfortunately for Nero, eventually the tide would turn for him. He is forced essentially out of the city, forced to commit suicide. There is a mob that comes after him, ready to kill him, and he commits suicide before they can do so. And that will end the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. It goes out with a bang for sure with Nero, crazy Nero. And so, we start with Julius Caesar, we start with Augustus, and we realize that although we had the Pax Augusta, things are not always as stable as that reign will be. That the idea of a dynastic succession doesn't always work, right? Because you want to pick the best person for the job. That's why, the founding fathers in the US chose not to have a king, you know, because they realized you need to elect people, that the automatic successor, the son or someone who is forced, you know, you have to have them related to the emperor, doesn't always work out. So we're starting to see evidence of that here, right? That just because Nero was the adopted son of Claudius does not mean he is the best person to rule. So next time, though, we're going to still be looking at a dynasty, the Flavian dynasty, who is again a family. And what they are going to do is try to right the wrongs that Nero had perpetrated on the city of Rome. And they're going to try to redress this by taking back the land that Nero took from himself in the Great Fire and built his Domus Aurea on. And on the site of that artificial lake, they are going to build perhaps the most iconic piece of Roman architecture ever, the Flavian Amphitheater, otherwise known as the Colosseum. So that's where we're going to end it. We have lots more exciting Roman art and architecture to get to, but that's where we're going to end it before the midterm. The midterm is on Thursday, so remember to review the guidelines for that. And Nero, it will go through everything that we've done so far up until Nero. So that's it for now. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to email before the midterm, and I'll see you next week.